Well, greetings and shalom. This is Adrian Scott, and I welcome you to Truth and Testimony, the broadcast. We're going to continue our series in Bible Break covering the book of Genesis, and in this particular video, we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 11. Now, I am reading from my handy-dandy King James Version. I encourage you to read along. You can follow on screen. If you have your own Bible, you can follow along with that. And it doesn't have to be a King James. It can be any version of the Bible. They all ultimately work. There's minor differences, but you're able to keep the flow going. I would also like to mention, if you haven't watched any of the previous videos where I cover the earlier chapters of Genesis, 1 through 10 here, I do encourage you to go back and check those out. It's always good to follow the Bible in sequence. You can pick it up and read any part at any time, but at some point you should read it beginning to end. That's my biggest piece of advice and suggestion. I just think you'd be doing yourself a favor. Picking up any other book and starting, 3/4 of the way through it would make sense. You'd want to start in the beginning so you understand the characters and what you're talking about. Well, the Bible's not too dissimilar in that fashion. You'll still understand more about what you're reading later when you get the earlier stuff. So I do recommend that. Plus, there's also a lot of prophetic connections in the Old Testament, in the Torah and the Tanakh, the Old Testament, to prophecies that we get in Daniel and in Matthew and in the book of Revelation. So to have those counterpoints and juxtapositions also really helps. And so the more thoroughly that you know this book, the better equipped you will be. Having said that, the last point I do like to make is, at least with the Bible breaks, what I like to do is I'll read the chapter in its entirety, then I will go back and comment. I will say there is a couple of big old topics in this chapter, and I'm looking forward to talking about them, and I hope you are too. So let's get right into it and read Genesis chapter 11. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, or Bavel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years and begat sons and daughters. And Arphaxad lived 35 years and begat Salah. And Arphaxad lived after he begat Salah 403 years and begat sons and daughters. And Salah lived 30 years and begat Eber. And Salah lived after he begat Eber 403 years and begat sons and daughters. And Eber lived 34 years and begat Peleg. And Eber lived after he begat Peleg 430 years and begat sons and daughters. And Peleg lived 30 years and begat Reu. And Peleg lived after he begat Reu 209 years and begat sons and daughters. And Reu lived 32 years and begat Serug. And Reu lived after he begat Serug 207 years, and begat sons and daughters. And Serug lived 30 years, and begat Nahor. And Serug lived after he begat Nahor 200 years, and begat sons and daughters. And Nahor lived 29 years, and begat Terah. And Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119 years, and begat sons and daughters. And Terah lived 70 years, and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren; she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So there is Genesis chapter 11, and not necessarily a ton of things to hit on, but there's a few big ones. So if we get right into it, and it is right at the beginning of the chapter when it talks about the whole earth was of one language and one speech, and that it talks about them being one. So this, to me, is something that connects to end times prophecy. There's an example right there, because one of the things that we read about heading into the end times is this sort of rebirth of this one world government and one world religion and probably one world financial system, and just getting back to very much what they had right at the Tower of Babel. Now, to me, one thing I always thought was there was a very significant sin being committed here. And that is in this idea that in verse 4, it says, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Yet, not too terribly long ago, God basically gave them a commandment that said, spread abroad across the face of the whole earth, be fruitful and multiply. So they get off the boat, and right away they start disobeying God. Oy, yeah. So I always thought that was a big significant one. And, it doesn't mention it specifically in here of God commenting on that. It's like, hey, I thought I told you to go out there and be fruitful. But it does say that the people is one in verse 6, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Come, let us go down and there confound their language and scatter them abroad. Here's another one. What an effective mechanism that was, because how many years after that fact are we now? And we are just overcoming that obstacle of these many languages, and still not perfectly, but we are just overcoming it now. I think that was a very effective tool, in my opinion. And we're starting to come back together. Now, this connects to something that's really interesting in verse 8. When it mentions the Lord scatters them abroad from thence from the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Take a moment and key in on that phrase, left off to build the city. It doesn't say that it was stopped forever. Right? At that point, they left off to doing it. To me, it paints a picture that at some point that could resume. And aren't we seeing that now? Aren't we talking about that now with one world government, one world religion? Right? That it was just a long pause as we had to gather back from him scattering us abroad so that we could continue to act wickedly as a species, corporally. I'm just all of us as humanity. So I always found that one absolutely fascinating. It's also really interesting if you look at most, I think it's one particular painting that it starts from, a representation of the Tower of Babel. But when you look at this, it's an artist render. I can't remember what artist it was, but it's a famous painting. If I can find a version of it, I'll see if I can put it on screen here. But if you look at the shape of the United Nations building, it is modeled almost to a T after that. And something I noticed when I was in Israel, we were walking down the street. We just went for a walk one day. I couldn't even tell you what part of Jerusalem we were in, but it was Jerusalem. And we're walking down the street, and I come over and we see this building, and I'm like, that looks an awful lot like the Tower of Babel. I still don't know what that building was, but the similarity was too striking to be coincidence. So I think that was done intentionally. I don't know what the building was or anything, but here it is, right in the smack middle of Jerusalem somewhere. And again, looking very much like this representation of the Tower of Babel. So I thought that was interesting, but more interesting, that connection to the UN building. So there's that one to look at. Then we get into, I kind of touched on this in the last chapter. It was that book of genealogy, but there's a very particular genealogy that they kind of spend a little more time breaking down here in chapter 11. And that is the genealogy going down through Shem, through Aram, and you end up basically down at Abram, who would become Abraham, and Lot. That all come through this one particular line. So they go through that whole thing to establish this lineage of Abraham. And they took a good, 26 or 27 verses to do it. So they expounded on that one. So God was trying to make a point here. Pay attention where he comes from. There's significance to that. So that's another interesting part. And I think the last thing that I would touch on with this particular chapter comes right at the end of chapter 11, in verse 31. So we get this sense that Abraham was told by the Lord to go to a place he didn't know where, and he just went strictly on faith. And it was accounted to him for righteousness that he obeyed, despite the fact he didn't know where he was going. I've always had a little bit of a problem with that. I don't want to step on too many theological toes here. But can I make the observation? Let me just read verse 31 here. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. So what it just told us was they were already heading there. As that group goes, they just didn't make it all the way. So they kind of stopped there in Haran. Eventually, Terah passes, and it falls on Abram's shoulders to effectively continue the journey. That's the way I seem to read it. So it's not like he was completely blindly going. Now, to be fair, I don't think he knew what to expect when he got there. But I think that the idea of where they were going was already there because Terah had already started this journey. And ultimately, Abram just concluded it. So, yes, I admit that it could very much be that he just had no idea of what to expect once they got there. He didn't know what it was going to be like, what the towns would be like, what the inhabitants would be like, or anything else. So really, that was an act of faith on that point to go. But not that the destination itself was completely unknown because the journey had already started sometime prior to him concluding it. So that's the last note I will make. I mentioned in the previous video that I might kind of reevaluate what I'm doing here and not necessarily cover the rest of the book of Genesis. I will say if I get a bunch of comments of people that would like me to continue, I'm happy to do it. And I may, come back to it, but later on in the future. But I think I'm going to slow down on it for right now because there's a lot of other chapters I'd like to talk about, particularly getting into some stuff in the New Testament. It's been a while since we've been there, and I would like to get into that. But there's some prophetic stuff, as I do think we're in some critical days right now, and covering some of those prophetic chapters, stuff like Ezekiel and Daniel and stuff in the New Testament is very much worth doing. I know Ray and I had been discussing this idea, and I really think we are going to do it. We'll probably do it sometime sooner rather than later. We still have to figure out the logistics of how to make it work, but to have the two of us actually do a complete reading with our interpretation and understanding of the book of Revelation. And I think that would be an exciting series to go through. The book of Revelation, oh boy, there's some loaded topics in there. And I have to say, for a lot of books in the Bible, it is one that has some wildly varied interpretations. So I do not claim to be an expert on that book. I can just mention some of the logistics of what I read. I have always tended to be a very technical reader. I notice things like little misspellings and grammar mistakes, but when a certain word is used, when particular words are used, I notice those little details like that. And that's helped me, I think, to understand a lot of what I do read, or at least apply it to what I might be hearing from other people, because I like to combine those opinions. And I figure when you mash it all together, somewhere and mixed in there, you're going to get a pretty good seed of the truth. So that's one of my strengths, and that's what I can bring to a reading of the book of Revelation. I would tend to defer to my brother Ray on that one for that particular book, because he has spent more time learning, studying, and analyzing the topic of eschatology or end times prophecy than I have. I have kind of dabbled with it a little bit, but honestly, just because it was something that there was a lot of it that confused me, and I found myself getting lost at parts of it that I just didn't focus as much on it as maybe even as I should have. But that's kind of the reality of it. So the point of saying all of that is, I think when you put the two of us together, we can bring some pretty good insight into this book. And so you can watch for that one. And that's the kind of stuff I'd like to get to. So I may, slow down a little bit on going through the book of Genesis here, if not stop altogether. Because really, the story of creation at its core really goes up. It is Genesis 1 through 11. That's really the creation account. And that is, in my mind, the foundation that pretty much the rest of the Bible is built on. And so that was the main part I wanted to try to do. And now we've covered it. So whether or not I do more, I think we've accomplished something pretty good here. And on that note, I will say, if you did enjoy the video or the entire series, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with others. If you have not watched any of those previous videos, I know I'm saying this at the end, but go back and check them out. You might have watched this one out of sequence, but it's not too late to get the rest of the story, and with the 10 chapters that I did prior to that. With that being said, I wish blessings to all of you in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Again, I thank you so much for joining us on this journey and for watching this video. And I will see you in the next video. And maybe have a little surprise of what the next Bible break will be on. Until then, I do say shalom and bye for now.